Good morning. I'm going to be talking about developing and sustaining a disease management program. And we're going to use the National Rabies Management Program as a case study. And I'm also going to be talking a little bit about disease management in general as kind of a platform and context for the next three talks in this plenary session. I think there's been, over the last 5 or 10 years, there's been a general recognition of the impact of wildlife diseases. And that in terms of the impacts to domestic animals and the impact to human health and safety. And I think that as a result, there's also been some increased pressure, social, political, legal, and perhaps financial pressure to control and eliminate disease. I also think there's been some increased awareness of disease management related to the COVID-19 pandemic. And the public has a general idea about things like serology and PCR testing and the concept of herd immunity and viruses and viral spread and spillover. And that helps to inform things that when we talk about disease management in wildlife populations, that they now have a sense for what we're talking about. And that generally is going to be helpful, I think, as we move forward with wildlife disease management. My perspective, of course, is as a wildlife biologist and a program manager. I've been working in the field for about 40 years now and been working with rabies for about 25 or 30 of that 40 years. And I still very much think that the mission is important in terms of the impact that rabies has on public health, on livestock and pet health, and on wildlife health, and also just the cost of living with rabies. I think the sweet spot, though, is there's, the problem definition, the disease ecology, the vector ecology, the surveillance is all interesting and important. But I think for many of us as wildlife biologists, the fun ends really is about that landscape scale management in terms of the proof of concept, the goal setting and planning, the enhanced surveillance, the implementation of the management action, and then good program monitoring and trying to sustain those programs. Whether that's to prevent introduction, whether that's surveillance and monitoring only, just a sort of as problem definition, or control to prevent the further spread, or elimination, eliminate the local, regional, and the national scale. I think there are lots of challenges that we could talk about managing diseases in wildlife there. Certainly we know it's hard to estimate populations, whether that's the target species or non-target species. It's hard to detect disease animals. In terms of doing good surveillance, it's hard to identify individual animals in terms of understanding the impact of your management action. And there's a diversity of public opinion, of course, and there's the traditional domestic animal treatments are not easy to apply to wildlife population. And of course, it always requires these large, complex programs that manage populations. I think there will be, or probably currently is, some commonalities among wildlife disease management projects. Generally involves a small but dedicated group of collaborators at the federal, state, NGO, university level. We're all working in these complex systems that are difficult to study, and it's at the landscape level. So again, it's at that scale and scope is required to do the work that we're trying to accomplish. There's also these long-term planning horizons that are hard to market. So you have to manage expectations and manage those setbacks. There's lots of unknowns in terms of disease and target species. And you're blending these traditional management approaches with these new strategies that can be difficult and complex to implement and to explain. And then there's always the conundrum of surveillance and program monitoring, how much, when, and is it effective in monitoring your program, and having enough research to be able to do that adaptive management and pivot in real time to change your management strategy to be more effective. And then there's always the chase for funding and scaling up and sustainability, and how do you ultimately measure success? Well, we've been at it since 1995, really boots on the ground since 1997, to try to manage rabies. And internally and within Wildlife Service, it's really been between the sort of three aspects of our program. That's the National Rabies Management Program, hand in glove working with the National Wildlife Research Center, and then the Wildlife Services operational program in more than 20 states, all working together to accomplish these goals. And it's really an applied, collaborative, field-based program where we're really working out in the ripples to manage rabies. And that's really a direct result of the collaboration that's going on at the field level, and our biologists in the field doing the management, on the ground management, doing the monitoring, program monitoring, and working side by side with our researchers at NWRC and universities and other partners to understand what's going on the ground. And it's also required these focused collaborations with state agencies, state agriculture, state fish and wildlife, state health departments, but also with industry and university and with our colleagues in Canada and Mexico as well along the borders to effectively manage. And really, we're sort of dealing with One Health before it was cool, because we had to work with wildlife health and agriculture for a very long time to implement this program. And what we kind of consider this the coalition of the willing. We continually look at trying to grow the coalition of the willing. And we use the German term, the Stammtisch, which is defined as the sort of the regulars table, where we can get together in person, after hours, before hours, where we can argue usefully. We have this honor in debate, and we understand that there's honor in debate. And that leads to good problem solving, because there's lots of problems that we had to solve. And those relationships are built over time, and really are the foundation for any kind of active management that we're doing. Because not everybody agrees with disease management. They still don't in wildlife population. But as Louis Pasteur said, opposition is a useful stimulant sometimes, because from the very beginning, you have lots of opinions from the bleachers, shouted at you from the bleachers. And for those that are working in the trenches, we have to decide when to pivot, when to decide that the path forward is still the best way to go. And you have to deal with people that are, sort of in the short term, they say it's going to cost too much. It's not going to work. In the midterm, they say it's going to cost too much. You can't sustain it. Long term, of course, they say it costs too much. The progress is too slow. But from my perspective, I think, like Ernest Shackleton said, optimism is the true moral courage. And we just had to keep going and make sure that we did the best job we can in a very applied way. And then maybe in terms of big corporate world and perhaps bureaucracies, they're always looking for sort of a straightforward solution and answer. And for every complex problem, there is, of course, an answer that is clear and simple, but it's also wrong. And that certainly holds true for wildlife rabies management, because it's inherently complex. There really isn't any simple answers, at least that I found over the course of my involvement in rabies management. When we first started, they talked a lot about, there's people against disease management in wildlife populations in general, particularly with oral rabies vaccine. They said it's wildlife medicine, it's not natural, it's oral vaccines not safe, it's not going to work, we got other priorities, it's going to produce artificial populations dependent on humans, and the diseases are beneficial for perpetuating natural selective forces. And the worst one of all, I felt, was that raccoon rabies could reduce populations and reduce nuisance populations. We have too many raccoons, and we felt like there was no agency in the world that wanted to manage the raccoon population with a disease that kills pets and livestock and people. On the pro side, we had lots of folks saying, wildlife populations are already artificial. They've an altered habitat, movement patterns have changed. We have parasites and all sorts of diseases that have been introduced into new areas in various combinations. And we have the tools to manage the deadly disease, so we have the responsibility to do it. And raccoon rabies, for the most of the United States, was a new mortality factor as a result of a translocation event that occurred in the 70s. And now raccoon rabies is all the way up into Canada. But historically, that was never a mortality factor. So that was sort of the why not approach. And that led to that sort of the understanding of the art and science of wildlife management as we see it. It's sort of seeing the possibilities, seeing the opportunity, seeing the potential, and understanding that political landscape so you can implement the program. And all of this is the result of standing on the shoulders of giants in wildlife rabies management in the United States. They were true pioneers and adventurers in wildlife management, where they were rewriting the book of what it meant to do wildlife management in the field and at the population level. And I was fortunate to get to work with everybody on this list, but these are the true heroes of wildlife rabies management. They were willing to stick their neck out, risk careers, and do all of that so that we could move this program forward. In particular, Dr. Dennis Slate, who's my brother from another mother and my mentor, who started this program, and Dr. Charles Ruprecht, who worked for the CDC at the time, and we still work close on all aspects of wildlife rabies management in the United States. Because they taught us to see those possibilities and those opportunities, and that led to these big ideas, these big audacious goals. So when we now have the largest coordinated wildlife disease management program ever undertaken in North America and perhaps globally. So ultimately, I think, I just wanted to say that their vision and dedication helped to shine the light on the path to wildlife rabies control and elimination. And I really appreciate all the hard work that they put in, everybody on that list. And from just a basic stepping back for a little bit of perspective on rabies, that it really still, even globally, it's a small community working together to fight rabies. The true rabies warriors, as I see them. We've been battling rabies for at least 3,949 years, give or take a few years, but it is the oldest described disease. It's deeply ingrained in myth and popular culture. It's one of the most feared diseases. It has the highest case fatality rate of any known disease. And it's a disease that targets the most vulnerable, and those children under the age of 15 at a global level. So it's still a significant public health burden, but yet it's been 100% preventable since 1885. There's still a daily threat for over 3 billion people. They live in countries where rabies is still a high risk, and the annual economic losses due to rabies is $8.6 billion. But it's a significantly underreported disease in many countries because the victims die at home, and its underreporting reduces rabies as a public health or an animal health priority in many countries. And most of those are directly result from canine rabies in dogs that cause the majority of human deaths globally. Fortunately, there's a new 0 by 30 goal, international coalition of folks that are looking to eliminate dog-mediated human rabies by 2030. Fortunately, in the United States and in Canada, we eliminated canine rabies due to mass dog vaccination campaigns, more modern, potent vaccines, and good dog control. And it was eliminated in the United States anyway in 1979, and then we had to re-eliminate again in 2007 after canine rabies got into the coyote population in Texas. And that was a real success story, or remains a success story, where the last canine rabies case we had in the United States was in 2004, and we were declared canine rabies free in 2007. So conceptually, when you have canine rabies, and before you eliminate it, rabies is circulating in the wild carnivores and bats and free roaming dogs, in owned dogs. Post canine rabies elimination, we're really only having wild rabies circulate in the wildlife reservoirs, and that transmission happens along the wildlife interface. So that's where we want to manage, because we know we're still living in a sea of rabies in the United States. 93% of the rabies cases are in wildlife. We have about 5,000 confirmed cases each year and over 60,000 people that are exposed. So, our goal was to manage rabies at its source. We're trying to manage the rabies virus variants. There's about 8 terrestrial rabies virus variants in the United States. Our primary focus is on managing the raccoon rabies virus variant in the eastern United States because it impacts the most people. We felt like it was a heavy lift, and we were going to try to make sure that we did the best job that we could, again, trying to manage rabies at the population level at the source. And, historically, prior to oral vaccination, in the United States, we used pesticides, strychnine, to manage fox populations and skunk populations to manage rabies. But ultimately, there was little evaluation, and the effectiveness was ultimately unknown. Fortunately, in 1971, Dr. Baer and others, and Jack Debby, did a proof of concept that you could orally vaccinate foxes and other species. And that work was done at the Griffin Lab in New York at the Department of Health. And then the Europeans kind of ran with it and tried everything from putting the vaccine in chicken heads to ultimately mass producing the baits, and really work to control rabies at the landscape level by setting up these ORV zones, really trying to essentially keep raccoons and from enzootic areas from getting into the rabies-free areas. And they've been very successful in Europe in controlling rabies in foxes. Since 1978, over 31 countries have used oral vaccination. Many have eliminated rabies within their borders, but overall the cases have gone way, way, way down. So very, very successful. My colleagues in Europe have done a fantastic job. And I think it was successful because they had a lot of dedication, a lot of collaboration, lots of sustained funding. But they also were working with foxes, which are lower population density compared to raccoons, larger home ranges. That you had to put out a lower bait density. The vaccine bait could have a lower titer in the vaccine, and the bait was very attractive to target species. And there was limited bait competitors. Our first field trials occurred in 1992, or excuse me, in 1990. Dr. Rupert led the charge when he was working at the Wistar Institute and put out over 3,000 baits on Paramount Island. And since then, there's been a couple of field trials again with the Rabies VRG. And that led to the development and evolution of the Wildlife Rabies Management Program, where we identified roles and responsibilities, looked for funding, understood the ecology of the raccoon, the ecology of rabies, and looked at the epidemiology and surveillance and how we would go about doing that, putting dots on the map so we made sure the zones were in the right place. And then looking at sort of field testing, a variety of vaccines, having the industry scale up. And then on our part, looking at field operations and logistics and how does that come about, and how do we refine that and be cost efficient in distributing baits, and then having that intensive program monitoring so that we could do that good adaptive management and continue the loop to make sure that we're doing a better job each year. Currently, there's 3 products and 2 vaccines available in the United States. The primary vaccine that we use is Rabies VRG. It comes in 2 forms, in the coated sachet and the fish meal polymer. And the coated sachet is the primary vaccine bait that we're using. And we're also been experimenting since 2011 with a vaccine called OnRab, produced by Artemis Technologies Inc. in Canada. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Again, we're targeting the unique challenge of raccoons. And we all know raccoons, as wildlife biologists, as ecological generalists, they have smaller home ranges, they travel in family groups or invigorated species, but they do require a little bit higher, tighter vaccine in order to vaccinate them. They have a unique way of potentially handling the baits, as well as the spillover species that we're concerned with in striped skunks. And so how do we make sure that the bait and the vaccine in liquid form gets onto the tonsils of the raccoon so they can be vaccinated? It takes a lot of coordination to pull this off. I think there's cross-border collaboration as well as cross-border collaboration among states, 18 states and Canada and Mexico. Been the collaboration. It's a lot of just sort of keeping everything in orbit. Lots of different players involved, and we love that. And I think it makes for a really good collaborative effort over time, where we can really focus on the goal of preventing the spread and ultimately eliminating rabies variants at the local, regional, and national level. And our model is pretty straightforward. It involves collaboration, it involves management with ORV and good program monitoring, and then implementing this enhanced rabies surveillance to supplement the public health surveillance where there hasn't been any kind of exposure, doing good applied research, and being ready if we need to implement a contingency action. Because we want to make that leap from preventing the spread to ultimately eliminating and being raccoon rabies free by 2053, and looking at that in a 30-year time frame. And again, those kind of time frames are hard to market because you have a lot to think about in terms of our treatments, target species, and the physical features of the landscape that could either facilitate or hinder your management action. So we've spent a lot of time working with our partners and researchers at NWRC looking at these various components for the target species, non-target species, as well as ORV treatment. And early on, we did a lot of napkin studies. Dr. Slate was famous for literally drawing research design on a napkin and handing it to us and having us go and implement a research project. And we did a lot of them early on. And mostly in the Northeast, when we were doing some sort of proof of concept and trying to understand, before we had trail cameras, who was coming to the bait, who was eating the bait. We had sort of the basic telemetry projects to look and see the movements of raccoons. And we did a lot of, and that basic information allowed us to do some really clear planning and looking at goals with an end game in mind. It also allowed us to collaborate at a bigger level where we could have the North American Rabies Management Plan that involved Canada, the US, Mexico, and the Navajo Nation, and develop the US National Plan for Wildlife Rabies Management, again, to have an umbrella document where all partners could see themselves in this document and be able to work side by side to implement rabies management. Of course, regulatory compliance played a huge role. And working with industry, it's one of the most interesting parts of my job, frankly, is working with industry, because obviously without vaccine baits, there's no program for us, and without a program, they have no market. So it's always sort of it's a very synergistic relationship. We've also spent a lot of time bringing groups of experts together around the table in what we call the Delphi approach. First time around, we looked at the raccoon rabies spreading west in absence of ORV intervention and how that might look to inform an economic model that Dr. Stephanie Swift was looking at for us from the National Wildlife Research Center. And what we found is that in absence of intervention, raccoon rabies would have spread significantly in the 2022-year time frame to the tune of a negative economic impact of about $1.2 billion. So, or about $58 million a year. And every year that zone stays in place, we still get the avoided cost of the spread. We also wanted to look, again, using this Delphi approach of large-scale ORV baiting to help us look strategically at how we would eliminate raccoon rabies. And I'll just show you, I'm just briefly go through this. Those yellow squares are counties, and we're going to see that over time that it goes basically marching raccoon rabies back to the ocean. And this is our sort of our 30-year plan, not quite prescriptive yet, but close. So the meat and potatoes of what we do in rabies management is obviously management with ORV. Requires us to be on work at about 19 airports in 11 states each year, and it involves some 140 Wildlife Services employees working from August to October primarily, and then in January again in Texas. We primarily distribute baits through fixed wing aircraft, but we also have been continuing to increase the use of helicopters just in sort of the urban suburban interface, and then hand baiting in the really highly developed areas. Different bait densities, different flight line spacings, but generally our zones are going to be a minimum of 25 miles wide. This is what our zone looked like in 2020. And that year we distributed about 9.5 million baits, and we had an area under management about 64,000 miles square across 18 states. And you can see over time that there's a little fluctuation in how many baits we put out. That's all about how we're designing our zones, and our rabies planners, Bob Hale and Bradley Hicks and others, how we design the zone and then decide how many baits need to get on the ground. But between the US and Canada, since 1989 or so, we've distributed about 260 million doses of the vaccine safely and effectively, which has helped in the United States for us to eliminate the dog coyote variant, as already discussed, an elimination of the Texas gray fox variant. And then there's been no appreciable spread of raccoon rabies west of our ORV zone. We've also been moving zones recently, and we've actually, in 2019, we made a significant move of moving the zone off the border with Canada, Quebec, and Ontario. And actually, that was in close collaboration with our partners to the north. And then in 2020, we removed an additional part of that zone along the border with Ontario and Quebec. They've been dealing with their own raccoon rabies outbreak. They effectively in Quebec and New Brunswick and Ontario eliminated raccoon rabies, but 2015 was a particularly bad year. We saw a reemergence in all the provincial areas. And fortunately in Quebec, they only had that one case, but Ontario and New Brunswick have been dealing with the reemergence ever since, but they are making good progress. And, this has been, again, one of the really great parts of working on rabies management is to get to work with my colleagues in Canada. It's been sort of a lot of friendly competition and spirited debate and lots of transparency and sharing data and cross-border research. And recently we developed this, what we're calling the Management Without Borders initiative, which is really a think tank, but it's a shared set of ORV management principles. And we're doing some multi-year strategic planning with some flexibility because this group right here is all working together to try to eliminate raccoon rabies from North America. And that sort of Management Without Borders initiative has led to, in 2021, this year, there's going to be no ORV distributed in Quebec for the first time since 2006, because they have such faith in our strategic planning and our transparency and the amount of surveillance that's going on. In fact, they're going to continue to do what they've done for many years now between Quebec and Ontario, and also Canadian Food Inspection Agency, the federal agency, have donated baits to put on our side of the border. So that's resulting in about a value of about $2.7 million over the years. So our goal is to look at both serology, looking at rabies virus neutralizing antibody as an index to population immunity, where we want to try to get that 60% seroprevalence, and also having good high quality enhanced rabies surveillance. And that enhanced surveillance piece continues to develop. It's sort of our early detection, early response mentality, where too much surveillance is not enough. And that's been our rallying cry for a long time. And when we talk about enhanced rabies surveillance, it really supplements public health surveillance where there's been no human or pet exposure to the rabid animal. So we're looking for those strange acting animals, road kills, hunter harvested nuisance control, sort of the standard way we can collect any way we can. And so each year you can see that our field force is collecting a lot of blood samples and also collecting a lot of brain stems. And we're putting those dots, positive and negative dots on the map to make sure that we are putting those zones in the right place so that we're not simply throwing baits that aren't doing the job. We also have our biologists, a number of our biologists do the direct rapid immunohistochemical test, the DRIT test, which is the easier way to say it. And they're basically doing rabies tests. So, and it's a kind of a field-based test that has allowed us to test samples right there and be able to quickly turn those around and again put more dots on the landscape. And we've been doing that since 2005. And right now our wildlife biologists, I think, are doing about 7% or 8% of all rabies tests that occur in the United States. So that's helping us again put dots on the map so we can do good program management. We also do a lot of intensive program monitoring, and we're stubbornly persistent in our approach there. And so that's meant over time that we've captured a lot of animals and sampled a lot of animals, and to the tune of over 200,000 raccoons over the years, as well as 20,000 skunks and thousands of other species to monitor our program. And that's led to a very robust serial library that we use to really look at what the vaccine's doing in populations over time. And you can see that the VRG vaccine has been effective in stopping the spread, but we weren't so sure at 30% seroprevalence whether that would get us to the ability to eliminate raccoon rabies. So we field tested starting in 2011 the Unrab vaccine and have done many, many field trials since then, some published and some to be published. And you can see that it performs about twice as well as VRG in terms of field effectiveness. We've had a little dip over time these last few years, and that's directly resulted in this graph anyway, is the result of some of really low seroprevalence that we're getting in urban suburban environments. And so that's one of our big challenges, is try to figure out what's going on there. For instance, our outdoor lab is Burlington, Vermont for our city. And you can see over time that it's definitely gone down. But the good news is there's been no raccoon rabies cases since 2016. But again, that trend is a little worrisome for ONRAB. And so we've spent a lot of time researching that, and I'll talk more about that in just a minute. Another building block for rabies management is communication. We have lots of annual notification about when we're going to drop baits, but we also want to reduce the likelihood that there's going to be vaccine bait contacts, because that ends up being problematic, because we get lots of calls about that, and we want to make sure that those are sent to the right folks if there's any bait contact. We do spend a lot of time telling our story and meeting people. That's sort of the building blocks of wildlife rabies management. Last year we did a homemade video that's to celebrate World Rabies Day. Our field biologists got together and filmed on their cell phones and came up with a nice video. And we kind of see it like an old folk singer that's still always singing the greatest hits, but we still writing and playing new material. So we just have to keep telling our story again and again and again. And some of the using new technologies and new platforms, we have a dashboard that's available to the public when we're out dropping baits on projects. You can actually access this and see what progress we're making in any given state or any area over time. And I think this continues to get better and better and better, and provide real transparency about what we're doing. In terms of applied research, again, working hand in glove with the National Wildlife Research Center, I sort of see it as like the sourdough starter that I finally figured out how to do. That it's just been a sort of a very productive relationship with NWRC, but also with universities and with our partners, CDC, and our state partners, to do that good applied research so that we can understand at the landscape scale how the species we're targeting are using the landscape. And again, that focus has gotten back down to the urban-suburban challenge, where we have those high densities of raccoons, non-target bait competition, and lots of supplemental food for raccoons. So we're trying to figure out how to identify what we consider that urban environment. Recently, we started looking at it sort of a different layer of on GIS and decided that about 13% moving forward as we try to march raccoon rabies back to the ocean is going to involve this urban-suburban habitat. So we have a big job ahead of us and want to make sure we figure that out. We also did 253 raccoon density studies since 1997 through 2011. This was just published with Dr. Slate, with the lead author on that. And you can see that there was in the urban-suburban environment, we had about 22.4 raccoons per kilometer square, so a little higher density than in the agriculture or forested landscape, which you might expect. But I think that, again, targets our effort. So we have to really understand what's going on with raccoons and skunks and with our non-target possum population. And we've invested a lot of time and energy in trying to figure that out, looking at home range overlap, mating opportunities. How would we refine that? What seems to be attracting, in this case, some skunks, a couple of skunks and a raccoon. And if you kind of hone in on those dots, you can start to look at it and see that it's really over one house. And then when we set up cameras, it was pretty obvious what was attracting animals to that neighborhood. And we're continuing to look at, this year, we're going to be working with the University of Vermont to look at a bait fate study, see what animals are actually picking up, a camera study actually picking up the bait, and also looking at a different way of distributing baits across the landscape, combining bait stations and hand baiting versus strictly hand baiting. We're always looking at hand baiting as different ways of trying to make sure the baits are getting out. We started using this point of interest, basically a GPS, to allow us to mark every time we distribute a bait. You can see over time we've gotten better coverage. This has not changed the serology, so that is interesting. That although we did a lot better coverage in post-bait sampling, it didn't seem to change the equation much. We're also working with what we're calling the VRG special height titer. It's they produced a little bit higher titer vaccine for us to see if it would be more effective in the field targeting raccoons. And so we did a field study in North Carolina in 2019 and 2020. In Maine, we did a field trial in 2020. And first year, it was pretty amazing. We got a seroprevalence of 56% and 52% in Maine. And that's even better than we have with OnReb. Unfortunately, the second year, it looks like it dropped very significantly in North Carolina, but we want to continue this over the course of 3 years in both states to see if this might have be the ticket for a new bait for us to use. So in the end, this has been a long, strange trip from 1995 to 2021. We're certainly too late for the rabies program to die young. We really have to start thinking about how do we manage through middle age. There's new problems, new solutions. But for us, it's just still a really exciting time to be involved in wildlife rabies management. And we can start looking over the horizon from 2022 to 2026 and those 5 year, and just know that we're going to get down to the basics again of dropping baits on the ground safely and effectively and stick to that sort of meat and potatoes fundamentals, knowing that we need to always demonstrate need and efficiencies and show progress to be sustainable politically, and making the case for who's benefiting first to stopping the spread and ultimately eliminating raccoon rabies. One of the things we know we have to do is continue to show progress. And so our goal in the next 5 years is to go from 18 states that are enzootic with raccoon rabies to 17 states, and essentially move the zone all the way out of Ohio and continue to work in Pennsylvania. So we hope we can do that. We think we can. We're going to continue to look to do that adaptive management and look for that sustainability. I think requires some creativity and fresh ideas for our model. We're going to look to the climate change and already started working to discuss about an entrance strategy should we end up with vampire bats in the United States, in Texas or Florida. That's some models that would indicate that climate change and based on proximity of vampire bats to the border, it looks like we might have within the next 5 to 20 years. And also looking at this interaction between red fox and Arctic fox and the impact on the rabies dynamics in the Arctic. We actually had a blue ribbon panel on this whole issue of surveillance and management and research of vampire bats and vampire bat rabies in the United States recently. Also continuing our research in support of a potential field trial on targeting mongoose on Puerto Rico. And that's coming along. It's about a 20-year effort. So we hope that that's actually going to happen working with our partners in Puerto Rico. Ultimately, the end game is continuing to cast a wider net for collaboration. I'm a beekeeper in my non-professional life, and I follow this guy named Ian Stepler, and he's just a great beekeeper. He's up in Manitoba, Canada. But he always preaches sometimes patience is your best investment, and I think that's true for taking the long-term view of managing the expectations for rabies management. We need to hyper communicate, tell our story, and telegraph our next move. So in relation to our management actions. Looking towards the future, I think what we do is we just put the best program we can on the ground that's in our control. We monitor those programs intensively. We conduct good applied research, and we apply an adaptive management approach to improved effectiveness. Thank you.